Now, okay, I want to start the meeting off by introducing Matt Foote, who may be known to many people as a human rights lawyer and an activist in Defend the Right to Protest movement. Matt.
Thank you. I want to start with a quote from July last year, and I want to see if you can guess who said this. "Just banging up more and more people for longer without actively seeking to change them is what you would expect of Victorian England." That was Kenneth Clarke, Minister of Justice, just after the coalition government had come together with the Lib Dems introducing a great reform bill. I'd recommend you go and have a look at that. There's actually nothing in it. But that was what the start of the government was about. It was about a Lib Dem Tory government that was going to be different. And Kenneth Clarke said he was astounded that the prison population had been doubled since his time as Home Secretary in 1992. He said it was impossible and ridiculous to imagine that, and that prison was not the answer. Now, following these riots, as you know, Cameron said that every single person involved should face the full force of the law. And what we've had is best described amazingly by the head of the Prison Governors Association, a man called McFarlane. It's like when you've got sharks and there's blood in the water and it's a feeding frenzy. There's a sentencing frenzy, and we seem to have lost sight of proportionality. So the guidelines that have been set down by the Crown Court judge is that if you stepped into a Tesco's or any shop and stole low-level goods, sweets, whatever it is, for one second, that's what you did. You face 18 months or 2 years in prison. People of good character who pleaded guilty, even if you're going to university, you're going to prison for 18 months to 2 years, according to the Crown Court judge, who dealt with the first cases coming through. The Magistrates Association criticised McLennan Murray, said he got it all wrong. But that is nonsense when you look at the two issues. The first is bail. There is a presumption for bail in this country if you're charged. It is presumed that you would get bail unless there are substantial grounds to show that you would reoffend or not turn up at court. And that is why only 10% of people are remanded. But of the riots, 2/3 of people have been locked up. And along with that are the sentencing that I've talked about. So we've got something like 1,000 people gone into custody, many on remand. And we've got record numbers of people in prison, the complete opposite. Let's say it again. Just banging up people, more and more people, for longer, without actively seeking to change them, is what you would expect of Victorian England. That's exactly what they've done. So that blanket policy of how to deal with social unrest, I just want to deal briefly, follows quite serious sentencing and blanket policies that we've had over the last few years. And those are reflected in the protests. Over 300 students arrested out of the student protests. I think you're getting up to about 100 charged with violent disorder. That is now the new charge, one of the top charges that they jump to straight away, knowing that people are going to prison if they're convicted. In the Gaza protest in 2009, 62 young Muslims went to prison on the back of the violent disorder charge, on the decision to charge them with violent disorder. And I think if you said to someone a couple of years ago that in a country like Burma, 300 students have been arrested, 1,000 people have been put in prison from social unrest, 62 protesters against Gaza, against the bombing of Gaza have been put in prison, people would be appalled. They'd be writing petitions, they'd be protesting, and that's what's happening in this country. I come on to deal with Cameron's explanation for what's gone on, which is that we've been beset by a moral decay. This, again, is extreme hypocrisy coming from Cameron, that the youth have suddenly been hit by a moral decay. What he said in 2006 was the complete opposite of how we deal with young people. He talked about the brilliance of Kids Company, who look after young people in trouble. And he said, to tackle youth crime and disorder for the long term, we will have to place real trust in the hands of people and organisations that understand young people and can offer the quality of care and emotional support they need. And now he is doing the complete opposite of shoving them into prison. So he got votes on the back of that sort of policy, that sort of liberal policy, and now he's doing the complete opposite. But just this whole argument about moral decay just reminds me of the arguments we've had for the last 10 years. I mean, this is what Labour have been saying for the last 10 years. The very first act they brought in was the ASBA, the Antisocial Behaviour Order. And they said that we had feral youth across the country from the year 2000. And it got into such a crescendo that Hazel Blears, every time the ASBO figures were announced, would come on the telly saying we've got more ASBOs to deal with the feral youth, knowing that that would mean that more young people were being locked up on simplistic banning orders. For every ASBO they brought in, they sold off a school playing field. That was what was going on for the last 10 years. They brought in a dispersal order in Tottenham, and the youth centre was in the middle of the dispersal order. The very place they're not allowed to go was to the youth centre, and we know that the youth services have been decimated. So that's what we've had for 10 years, and what was promoted then by Charles Clarke was the idea that 1 in 4 youth were yobs. That was the front page of the Mirror and the Sun after Charles Clarke promoted that. So it's more of the same from Cameron. I'll just finish on the 2 things I want to finish on. The first is that it's one law for the rich and one law for the poor. And I take 3 examples. The first is Andy Coulson. His door wasn't smashed down. The very door that needed to be smashed down to seize material. He was welcomed at his front door at a pre-arranged meeting and taken to the police station and granted bail. The Commissioner, Paul Stevenson, we're talking about here a story of masses of people going to prison for low value theft. This is a man who had a 5-week free stay, £12,000 for free. A man on £260,000 a year. The money, the PR person for the company where he stayed, the luxury spa where he stayed, was his PR man on £1,000 a day. Was also a former News of the World executive, the very organisation that the police had failed to investigate twice over the last 4 years. And on top of all that, Stevenson went to The Guardian personally and said, I think you should stop reporting this story about News of the World. Now, Paul Stevenson resigned with his integrity intact. Theresa May said he was an excellent commissioner and it's sorry to see him go. He didn't face any criminal charges for that, and he didn't even face any disciplinary charges. And I imagine he's going to make a very nice, healthy pension packet from the public purse. That is the contrast between what's happening in the riot and what happens at the top. And the last person I want to deal with is Hazel Blears, who, I don't know, you must all remember, she wrote the cheque. She'd, along with all these MPs who'd been overclaiming thousands of pounds to do up their posh homes, had written a cheque for £13,500. That was the amount she'd overclaimed. And she did it all on telly, and she said, I'm doing this because I want people to like me. And I thought, there isn't any figure you could put on that cheque that would make that a reality. But she is the very one who was promoting young people going to prison for simply hanging around in the street, and avoids a prosecution for so much more. And I just want to finish on this. It seems to me that we've got a battle ahead. 1,500 people have been arrested so far. The police are intent on carrying on for 2 years. They've only just started on the CCTV. And we have to do what's the start of here, is pull together organisations, the moral voice of people who are appalled by the fact of a graduate going to prison for 18 months for stealing a small number of goods from Tesco's in this riot. It reminds me of the Asbos. About 6 or 7 years ago, I went to court and I dealt with a man who had one leg, and they were imposing an ASBO on him for begging. And there was a fairly obvious reason why he might be begging, but they imposed the ASBO nonetheless. And I found out that 99% of ASBOs were granted because the rules were so bloody easy to get the ASBOs. And I just decided that we couldn't have this, and you have to step outside the court, and we set up a campaign to pull together as many people who were appalled by this and organisations. And that was something called ASBO Concern, which was very successful in changing the agenda. And actually, when Gordon Brown came in, they actually changed their tone and stopped imposing ASBOs, and now they're on the way out altogether. But that sort of process is what we have to do now with the sentencing. We have to pull together everybody who's appalled, youth workers, teachers, anybody who's connected to this thing, families who are connected to it, and to pull them together to show that we don't all agree with this. We don't all agree with the front pages, that sort of crap that was going around in 2005 that they were trying to promote. We don't agree with it then, and we don't agree with it now. And I think if we can do that, we can change the climate, and we can bring down the sentencing, and we can bring down the number of arrests. Thank you.
Matt, and there is a national campaign which Matt is a leading member of. Defend the right to protest, defend protesters against criminalisation, stop kettling and challenge police violence, support the right to organise, strike and demonstrate. If people would like to visit the stall at the back of the hall, they would be very... And I hope people saw that last week it was reported that the IPCC, the Independent Police Complaints Authority, had actually found against the arrest of Jodie McIntyre, who was pulled from a wheelchair and battened on the police protest, and was found to be absolutely not guilty of the charges against him. And that is something which I think is very significant inside of the police today. And again, we've seen the massive demonisation of working class families as a result of the riots, with the announcement in some councils that they are evicting families of people who have been found guilty inside the riots. And just as we saw on the television last night, the wonderful protest at Southwark Council when they made their announcement, so too will we be on the steps of Hackney Town Hall if they dare to go down that road as well, demonising working class families for because of the riots. To introduce to you Owen Jones, who is a Hackney resident and who is the author of an amazing book called Chavs, the Demonization of the Working Class. Owen.
Well, we've heard a lot about looters and hooligans in the past few weeks. I think that's why we're all here today, aren't we? So let's talk about them. Let's talk about hooligans and looters. People who trash public property, steal from innocent people, and drive people out of their homes. Of course, I'm talking about the Conservative Party and their allies in the Liberal Democrats. Hooligans and looters in finely pressed suits who speak in crisp public accents. They're not masking up and trashing and setting fire to libraries. Instead, they're shutting them down with a stroke of a pen across the country. They're not mugging the poor in the streets. Instead, they're taking their benefits away from them by legal statute. And they're not burning people out of their homes. Instead, they're slashing their housing benefits in what has been called by one unnamed Conservative minister comparable to the Highland clearances. Now, George Bernard Shaw was a great British playwright decades ago, and he said one side preaches the class war and the other practices it. And this is a government which is certainly practising it. It's a government of millionaires that has cut corporation tax for the wealthy, but increased VAT tax which falls on the poor. They made working people pay for a crisis which was caused by the banks. They've a government made of so many ministers who went to public school, who had schools which the fees were 20k a year, have taken away EMA. which is a relative pittance from working class kids at sixth form. That's what we're dealing with. These are the real rioters and looters, if you like, at the top of society. Now, that's not to look at the riots that took place and just dismiss what happened. These were traumatic, these riots, for working class communities across the country. And often those who felt they suffered the most were some of the people in the poorest working class communities. In fact, I spoke to a woman in Hackney on Mare Street, a kid clutching her leg. He was terrified by what had happened. She was angry with the police because she felt they'd pushed the rioters onto her estate. And there's been a furious backlash that's taken place, and it's been manipulated by the right. And the people it's been directed against are single parents, people on benefits, and black people. All of those people have been attacked and scapegoated by right-wing commentators. Now, to understand what happened isn't to justify. And I've been attacked, as many others have, in that awful atmosphere that followed the riots. For even trying to understand was seen as justifying mindless violence. But we've got to look at the realities in this country. That 1 in 5 young people are now out of work. It's the highest ever. That in Tottenham, for example, 1 in 2 children grow up in poverty. That London is one of the most unequal Western cities on earth. The top 10% were worth more than 270 times more than the bottom 10%. And we live in a hyper-consumerist society where your status has so much to do with what you wear and what you own. Now, that lethal mix of inequality and consumerism, especially in a place like Hackney, I think had so much to do with what would happen. And of course, everyone responds differently to their circumstances, and only a small minority came out and rioted or looted. But it only takes a small fraction of people who feel they have no future to respond in that way, to bring chaos and violence to the streets of Britain. And this is what we've seen, in my view, because these cuts which are in the pipeline haven't hit yet. It's a dark foreshadow of far worse to come. And I want to talk about these sentences. What we're seeing, in fact, when I just before I came, I was having an interesting Twitter row with Peter John. He's the leader of Southwark Council. And Southwark Council, like other councils across the country, are evicting, and made their intention clear to evict the families of rioters, innocent people. Now that is collective punishment. And we're also, and we need to state that loudly, it's collective punishment. But also, they are putting a precedent that if you are poor, you will be punished twice. You will not just be punished through the justice system, we will take away your benefits and we will throw you from your home. Now, many of the MPs who stood up and demanded tough action against the rioters, I'll name one, a backbench Labour MP, Gerald Kaufman. He claimed £8,500 worth of public money to get a Bang & Olufsen TV set. Now, many of these MPs, these MPs claimed for the same sorts of widescreen TVs that were being carted out of shops the other week. And they got away with it. But we have to look, we have to find a response to what happened. Now, I'm glad we have here Right to Work, the fight for every job, because that is at the centre of what happened. Because there's so many young people now who genuinely feel they have no future to risk at all. And my fear is that anger, that frustration, that lack of hope, if you like, will express itself in all manner of ugly ways. People have to be organised, and their frustration has to be organised in a positive political direction. Because if it doesn't, what we have seen, as I said, is the foreshadow of a lot worse to come. So I hope all of us in this room today will think about how we move forward and actually think of a way of organising young people in communities like this who do not have hope as things stand. That is our mission. Thank you.
Cameron and Nick Clegg absolute hard class fighters, but let's be absolutely clear about it. Their cuts and their cuts programme will hit black people and women the hardest. And we're very proud tonight to have with us Zita Holbourne, who is from black activists rising against the cuts and who is also a member of the Civil Servants Union National Executive, who again are at the forefront of fighting against the government cuts in the civil service. So, Zita Holbourne.
Greetings everyone. Well, first of all, my apologies for being late. It just shows that we need investment in our public transport when it takes 3 buses and a cab to go from a neighbouring borough into a neighbouring borough and takes over 2 hours. So my apologies, especially to the other speakers who I haven't heard, if you've already spoken. I'd like to start by saying that the riots don't occur for no reason. But politicians and the media would have us believe that young people just picked themselves up for no reason at all and decided to take to the streets and loot. And the culture, so-called culture of young people has been blamed. We've heard that young people are lazy, they're idle, they're violent, they're louts, they're thugs. Effectively, young people have been demonised. And the riots have been racialised, because we've seen in the press and we've seen from politicians them blaming black youth in particular and a so-called black culture, and talking about white youth becoming black. So, if you steal something, you become black. So I think when David Cameron stole taxpayers' money for his conservatory roof resealing, he must have become black at that time as well. And it's not just young people that were involved in the riots. There were a range of ages. Yet they focused on young people and blamed everything on young people, and conveniently forgotten about the death of Mark Duggan, which is what initiated the riots. And Mark Duggan is one in a series of black people this year who have been killed in police custody, and not just, at the hands of the police. And it isn't just black people, but there have been a series, one after the other. And for politicians to then say, well, no, they've just taken to the streets for no reason, they're just greedy, they wanted something for nothing, they don't want to work. It's a complete and utter nonsense. And government and the media have tried to dismiss poverty, dismiss deprivation, dismiss the fact that EMA has been slashed, dismiss the tripling of tuition fees, unemployment, and cuts, which has led to unprecedented rates of unemployment amongst young people, and even higher amongst young black people. And if we look at the sentences people that are being given, they're completely ridiculous. They're not proportionate to the crimes. You look at what people get for rape, and then you see somebody take 2 scoops of coffee ice cream and he's gone to prison for 2 years for that. Didn't break into the premises, saw it open and passed. It's ridiculous. And I'm getting quite fed up, because I've spoken at a lot of meetings and spoken in the media and in the press with people assuming that because I understand the root causes of the uprisings, and I'm speaking about the root causes and what we need to do about that, that must mean that I accept violence and think that violence is okay and people's properties being destroyed is okay, because that's not the case at all. Of course it's not okay. But to blame, poor people and blame young people for the government to take no responsibility at all is completely disgraceful and irresponsible. If you look at the example that politicians give, corrupt politicians who've stolen taxpayers' money, for luxuries we've already just heard, TV sets, luxury carpets, jacuzzis, bridges, goodness knows what else. I don't know why you need a bridge in your back garden, but, and then you look at the huge organisations that are avoiding paying their taxes and getting away with it each year. And each year, 120 billion is lost in tax evasion, tax avoidance, and uncollected taxes. And if that was collected, it would meet 2/3 of the deficit. And that would mean that that money could be invested in jobs, in education, in resources that people need, in addressing poverty and deprivation, in housing, all the things that we need. And we need, I think, urgently, and I know it's happening already, but it is urgent because the sentences are continuing, effective legal representation in the first instance for young people. But actually, recovering from what's happening to them is going to take a long time, because once they're in the judicial system, they've got a sentence, they've gone to prison. That impacts on them when they come out. It impacts on them, you know, mentally, spiritually, but it impacts on them physically when they come out because they've got a record. So it doesn't solve the problems of poverty and deprivation. It doesn't solve the problems that they're facing in their communities. And I think one of the things that we really need to do is to rebuild communities and rebuild the relationships between younger people and older people, black people, white people. Everybody needs to go together. It's good that coming to a meeting like this is a cross-section and a mix of people here at this meeting today. And we need investment and support for families and for communities to rebuild that trust. But we particularly need to listen to young people. We need to listen to how they're feeling, how it's affected them, why were they out on the streets. But we need to politicise young people. We need to work with them, you know, so that they can channel their anger and frustrations about what's happening to them in a constructive way, so they can fight back. We can all fight together against all the attacks on us that we're facing from this government, the attacks in terms of, you know, the poverty, the cuts, the discrimination, the deaths in custody, the injustice, it's economic and social injustice that we're facing right now as ordinary working class people. And we need to bring all of those elements together because they all are related as far as I'm concerned and work together. And one of the things BARAC is doing, Black Activists Rising Against Cuts, it's working with a sort of new initiative, which isn't a new organisation, it's an initiative been put together by a number of different organisations called Operation Hope and Recovery. And the aim of that is to mobilise young people, to provide them with resources and mentoring and training, and to have a big national voters drive, because that's where real empowerment comes from. You know, if we have people voting and politicised and getting involved in politics, then we can kick these disgusting Tories out, because they have no place, you know, running our government. They're supposed to be listening to us. They're supposed to be listening to what our needs are. They're supposed to be serving us as a people. They're elected officials, but they're a law unto their own. So when they talk about young people breaking the law, I think they need to look in their own house and get their own house in order, first of all. And they need to stop breaking the law before they start telling people, because what example are they setting to anybody if they're constantly breaking the law? They're constantly corrupt. And that's what people see, yeah? When they look at them. They don't see a conscientious, responsible government who's actually listening to the people that elected them. Well, I don't even want to mention the people that elected them, but, you know, because they weren't actually elected, were they, in reality? But I think, you know, meetings like this are a positive way forward, but what we need to do is not just to meet and speak, we need to act on our words and make sure that we do put systems and processes in place to work together within our communities and to support young people and to stop the demonisation of them and defend them in whatever way that what they need defending, whether that's through the legal system, morally, spiritually, mentally, in every way. Thank you.
Zita says, let's take that message very loud and very clear to the people who are implementing the cuts, and that is this Tory government. On the 2nd of October, there is a demonstration called in Manchester where the Tory party conference will be taking place by the Right to Work campaign. We need to make sure that that demonstration is a massive demonstration, black, white, old, young, gay, straight. We need to show that we are united against what they're trying to do, and that is they are trying to divide us. And they are not only trying to divide us, they are trying to whip up racism in order to divide us on the streets by getting the EDL and people like that out and encouraging them, as we've seen in the back of the riots, but moreover in Tower Hamlets this Saturday. And so what we have to do is protest and protest hard and come together as communities in order to stop these attacks. And that is exactly what Gary McFarlane has been doing in Tottenham, an eyewitness to the riots, but also a very central figure in organising the defence campaign in Tottenham. Gary.
I was on holiday in Egypt, actually, flew back to Tottenham into the eye of the storm, and as the rebellion was breaking out, I was reminded of something that one of the guides from going around the pyramids had to say. Very nicely spoken middle class man, well educated. He's told me that, well, the poor in Egypt, the thing about Egypt is people know their place in life, so the poor, they don't get upset about that sort of thing. They don't want other people's goods and property and stuff, so they're quite happy in their life as it is. So I was very glad to come back to England to see that actually people weren't happy and the poor were not happy in their lot. And I think that's the same in Egypt, actually. If you just step outside this nice little middle class residential area, he lives where one of the BARAC's houses is, he told me. But I mention that because I think this is part of a process. I don't think this has happened in isolation in Britain. I don't think it made global news in the way that it did in isolation from everything else that's been going on in the world. I don't think lots of those kids who were, or lots of black kids who were the shock troops of the rebellion in Tottenham and elsewhere, I don't think they've missed what's been going on in the rest of the world either. They've seen the students have their riot, inverted commas, which I applaud, the destruction of Millbank. Just didn't get to the bit where the actual Tory party headquarters is, get the intelligence a bit better next time, but we destroyed most of the building. I applaud that. The trade unionists that had the biggest march ever in trade union history, I believe, a few months ago. I think it's all part and parcel of the same thing, which is that we live in a country, and we live in countries on a global basis, where the rich get richer and the poor are told to pay for it. Or we're told to pay for the banker's crisis, we're told that you can't go to college anymore, even though you went to college with a grant, maybe, and you all got paid for by the government, you're an MP today, but apparently we can't afford these things anymore. All of that, the kids in Tottenham have heard about. They've heard about a lot more than that, the stuff that we don't hear about very much, because maybe we're not young black males. But if you are, you certainly do know about it. So, this uprising, we're told, was all about mindless rioting. Let's just take two issues, the police and looting. So I think the riots were about those two things. And I think those two things are actually not mindless at all. In fact, they're very, very political. That's what we saw in Tottenham. The police. Mark Duggan was executed by the police. We still don't know the details because we live in a democracy, so we don't know these things. But they have told us where he was shot. So he was shot in the chest. He wasn't shot in the head, as people thought he had been. But anyway, he was executed. There was a demonstration from Broadwater Farm, a couple of hundred people to the police station, which we've done very many times because very many people have been killed by the police in this country, black and white. And people stood outside, patiently outside the police station, and just so people know that these things have happened before. We had a very peaceful demonstration of 2,500, mostly black people, around Somali culture's murder by the police. There was no violence at all. So this could have ended exactly the same way, perhaps, but it didn't, because the police decided that they weren't going to come and talk to anyone in their community, but they were meant to be policing, providing a service for. I've always found that a strange use of words. But anyway, so no one came out, and people got rather frustrated. And when a young woman went to talk to the police officers that are now confrontationally lined up in front of the police station, she got bludgeoned to the ground by said police officers, and it all kicked off. The violence came from the police in the first instance, something that's never talked about in the media. And what happened then? Well, there was an attack on the police station. That's where the attack came from, understandably. There was 2 patrol cars that had been left idling, which were torched, basically. And the more and more that the police did nothing, or appeared to do nothing, the more and more that people decided to take matters into their own hands. That's essentially what happened. And if you look at the looting that took place, again, you have this kind of vision from the sky helicopter, maybe, I don't know where, but they have this vision of a burnt-out, gutted Tottenham high road, and the heart had been ripped out of the community. Although I didn't know PC World were a part of the community, but there we are. All ripped out of the community. But if you walk up Tottenham High Road today, actually most people that I brought up there with, not from Tottenham, are surprised, but it hasn't actually been totally shredded. Oh, you do still have shops around here? Yeah, we do, yeah. Oh, you still have lots of Turkish shops? Oh, yes, we do, yes, yeah. And if you look at the ones that got hit, well, look, the biggest hit was 4 betting shops, which we know something about in Tottenham, because we had a recent campaign in Tottenham to stop Paddy Power opening a betting shop in place of Everybody's Music, which has been there for almost 30 years. People might know the top of Seven Sisters Tube there. It's been there forever, selling reggae music. They wanted to get rid of it, because the rent had gone up and so on. There's a little campaign to highlight the fact that we have 38 betting shops in Tottenham and the environs. And on the other side of the borough, it's a tale of 2 boroughs, perhaps, but in Muswell Hill, which I like to go to Muswell Hill, in Crouch End, nice restaurants and so on, they don't have any betting shops. Why would they have betting shops? Because they prey on poor people, don't they? And so they were targets. So 4 of them got burnt to the ground. I just said to Stafford Scott, one of our people in the defence campaign, that's very highly political. He said, well, they're just going for the money. Well, a bit of both is what I like to think anyway. And I don't condone them for either act, to be quite honest. What else got burnt? Unfortunately, there was the first place that went was a little music store that sells amps and stuff and so on, which I'm not in favour of looting as it goes, but kids tell me that the prices are too high. That's often the case with independent traders. They're not Tesco's, they can't buy big scale stuff, whatever. Anyway, so that got trashed and people got their mics out of there and what have you. But then the next one was the police solicitor, the custody solicitor, whatever they're called. Perhaps Matt can be correct with this, but the person that the police give you when you get nicked tend to be rubbish, unlike Matt, and then tend to tell you to plead guilty and do whatever the police say. So that got burnt to the ground. The youth offenders, Carringay Council's youth offending project, that windows got put in. Barclays Bank, the windows got put in. Okay, by which time we got to Allied Carpet, or whatever it's called now, Carpet Right, I believe it's called, that got burnt to the ground. Unfortunately, people live above it. I'm not saying that's something I'm in favour of. If there's any media here, I'm in favour of people getting burnt out of their houses. I'm not in favour, but perfectly honest, people didn't set out to kill anyone or burn them out of their houses. They set out to make a statement, and it's a pretty damn good statement. That there's towers of smoke pluming across the London skyline, as people said from other countries. Gosh, that looks a little bit like Mogadishu or Baghdad or whatever. And there was a war going on, and it was actually a class war. And as kids have said, it is a war against the law. That's how some kids have expressed it. So basically, Tottenham came to the template, if you like, for what was going to happen elsewhere in London. And the question of the police is basically, well, why are they attacking the police? If you don't know anything about it, maybe you find it a bit odd. Why is the police just here to help us, to do things for us and make life nice? But unfortunately, if you're a black youngster in Tottenham or anywhere else in this country, or if you're a working class kid basically lives in the state, the police are something else. They are the bane of your life. They're the source of authority in your face. And it means that they oppress you, essentially. And isn't that an exaggeration, oppressing people in England in 2012, where we are? But that is the reality. So, for example, these dispersal zones, which we probably don't know much about, because they don't put up little signs saying you're now entering a dispersal zone, but they don't need to, because they're only hunting for black males. And so you can talk to black kids who've been stopped. In my youth, perhaps it was like you got stopped maybe once a week in Sussex laws, whatever it is, or maybe once a month, whatever. But kids are getting stopped like 6 times a day, and that's not unusual. So basically, it's impossible for young black males, in particular, to walk the streets of London in any large group. A dispersal order means that if you're in a group of more than 2, then the police can just break you up. And that's what's going on, basically, and has been going on for years. And the Labour Party made it a lot worse with all the laws that they introduced. So when people saw the opportunity to have a go back at the police, they had to go back. And they told their mates about it in Hackney. They told their mates about it in Suffolk. They told their mates about it in Manchester. It's not very difficult to work out. And actually, these are all kids with all the same problems. Now, an oppressive police force, a society that gives them nothing, doesn't give them safety, doesn't give them any respect, and certainly doesn't give them any jobs or any hope, and then having to go back. So this became an opportunity to have a go back. So, do I condemn the riots? No, I don't condemn the riots. I think Malcolm X said about something else, but it doesn't make me sad, it doesn't make me glad. It actually makes me very glad that people are actually rising up and saying we're not going to stand for it anymore. No, it's true, but anyone expects to see a perfect revolution where all the good people line up on one side and all the bad people line up on the other side, all have nice little fights in the middle, and we score points to see who's won and no one gets hurt. We'll never live to see the revolution, as Russian revolutionary once said, because it doesn't happen that way. So lots of horrible bad stuff goes on the margins, and then you get the people that run the media in this country pick out those bad things and blast them all over the media to make it all look like that. When in truth, actually, it was a chance to get back at the police. That's what was going on. And there's a chance to do some shopping, to be quite frank. No, I've got my iPad, I've got a job, I can go and buy it. But actually, if they keep trying to sell you this stuff on the TV and you haven't got any money, try and put your head where those people are who've got no hope of ever getting, if you're into Apple stuff, I just happen to be one of most businesses. But if you're into whatever it is, if it's the Beats headphones that cost 150 quid for the entry level one, I don't know if people know this, but they're very, very fashionable, designed by Dr. Dre and da-da-da-da, but then to get the top line one, it costs 400 quid. How the hell are people going to afford that stuff? You know, or, you know, the trainers that they're selling, what, for 75 quid, and they cost 4 quid to get some children in China to make them. That is the real theft, that's the real robbery. So I don't have any problem with people looting, because the real looters in this society are the bankers, the people at the top of society who do it with their pinstripes and their computers that we never see, and they steal literally trillions of pounds. You know, this quantitative easing thing, printing money to give to the bank so they can lend it out at higher interest rates and then giving them more bonuses for doing that. I mean, that's thieving, that's just pure theft. Right, just to move on. And so I think it's all been covered, but this is like class war. And we've been here before. Every time their system goes into economic crisis, people rebel. Now, if you're an organised worker, you can rebel by going on strike. If you're a student, you can go on big marches, what have you. If you're an unemployed working class kid, maybe you can do those things as well, or help out, but maybe you'll do some other stuff as well. And that's what happened. And that's what happened in this country in the 1980s. There was big urban insurrections all over this country, even in some very small places where you wouldn't expect a riot to take place. And in the 80s, I believe that you know, riots of black and white working class kids, lots of them unemployed, with no hope, mass unemployment. Margaret Thatcher was giving this at the time, and people fought back in the only way they could see they could fight back and make an appeal to wider society. And that's how they did it. It happened again in the 19th century. You know, when there was hardly any black people in this country. 1886, in Birkenhead, up in the north-west of England, near Liverpool, there was rioting broke out. This is the first Great Depression. They called it the Great Depression in the 1880s, the big downturn of the economy, but they had to, obviously there's another Great Depression in the 1930s. It keeps happening, and now we've got another one. And anyway, there's an insurrection in Birkenhead, where people, for 4 days, attacked the police and looted the shops. Sound familiar? Okay, it wasn't 4 days. We did, what, 2.5 or something? I don't know. But anyway, it happened before. And what linked it together? Economic crisis and them trying to make us pay for it. So whenever you have an economic crisis, you get a growth in disrespect of authority and disrespect of property rights. That's basically what happened. You know? People saying, you've been stealing off us all these years, we're going to go and get our chance, we're going to go and get some of it back. And that's what people did. So we have been here before. And where do we go from now? So I have to sum up. Well, to be honest, wandering around the riot in Tottenham, normally in these situations, I can see some older people here, you know, have uprisings or riots in your area, you'll bump into other people from the Labour Party or from various black nationalist organisations, whatever it is. And what is quite obvious this time around is the lack of any political leadership, which is, you don't really expect it to be on the ground inside a riot, but you would expect it to be elsewhere in society. But no, it wasn't, was it, really? Mr. Lammy, our MP in Tottenham, all he could think of to say was how horrendous this was, how disgraceful all of this was, and lock them all up and basically open the door for the right wing to do even worse than that. So there's been a crisis of political leadership, if you like, and I think that now we have an opportunity, because the kids have spoken pretty loudly, and actually have spoken in a very massive way. At Mark Duggan's wake is 9 days after your death in Jamaican culture. You have your wake, and 1,500 kids turned up to that. Now what's significant about that is they turned up from all different postcodes. As people will be aware, like this postcode thing where kids can't travel from one part of London to another, or one borough, inside one borough even. But all of that was starting to break down. And then what will that tell us? But actually, the killing of Mark Duggan actually united many of these people we talk about in gangs, which is basically this big affinity groups. Of course, there's sometimes criminal gangs involved in terms of the drugs trade, what have you. That's where the postcode thing comes from, who can sell where and stuff. But generally speaking, it's just big affinity groups. But lots of those groups have now basically declared peace, want to now work together, want to now know what the next step is, how do we defend ourselves, how do we get more political and start to put our demands properly to society. All of those discussions are starting to go on at the bottom It's not being reported in the media or what have you, but actually it's our opportunity as people, as political people, to actually start to meet up with the youth. A lot of them who aren't here, not many for very obvious reasons, you know, don't want to get nicked by the coppers or whatever it is, or just don't think these sorts of events are for them, so we have to go to them. So in the defence campaign in Tottenham, that's exactly what we started to do, and so we leafleted Broadwater Farm on Sunday, did another estate last night, with bus cards telling people what their rights are, a number of a lawyer to ring, and so on, to show that actually we know, we can hear their anger, we know where they're coming from, and we want to help, because it's not always that obvious what you can do to help. You know, you can seem like a step removed. All these youths, you can't talk to them, you can't approach them, what have you. It's like the other. When in truth, actually, of course you can, just like you and me. Like even in the height of the riot, you can talk to people, why are you fighting each other? Stop fighting, we should be united tonight. And people stopped fighting and did get united. You know, where you could intervene. These people aren't from Mars, they're part of our working class communities. And so to finish then, it's a bit like, it's not quite the LA riots, there was nothing like the scale of LA 92, but something similar, as I say, is happening down below, where you can actually, you'd envisage maybe in a year or a few months' time of getting 700 of those rioters or ex-rioters into a room and starting to get really political. And that's the sort of work that the Black Panther Party in the United States did, in a far different time, different place, I know, but it's the kind of work that they achieved in far more difficult circumstances. You know, the Detroit insurrection, you know, you had, what, 45 people dead, you had hundreds of dollars worth, millions of dollars worth of property done, of damage, you had white sharpshooters on roofs, shooting at police officers and so on, but nevertheless, the Black Panther Party built an organisation from what they call the Brothers on the Block, precisely these kids who were selling drugs one minute, but the next minute they were reading about Karl Marx and Chairman Mao and various others, as it happens, and you know, they had various rules about, you know, don't get high on your gear whilst you're on duty as a party member and so on, which is an advance, you know? And I think we can do a similar thing in this country. We can those kids get political already, but we can join in that and help to politicise those kids and to show that actually a rocket goes up like a riot goes up like a rocket, comes down like a stick. At the end of the day, they've got more police than we've got petrol bombs, you know? The way to paralyse the state is actually the fact that we are the ones that do all the work. We need to connect it up. The battle of the trade unionists, the battle of the students, and the battle of the youth on the streets, and say that actually we're the ones that create all the wealth of society, and we should own it collectively and produce things for the good of all, instead of a tiny minority at the top, taking it all and then telling us how to live our lives. So it's got nothing at all to do with black culture, and it's got everything to do with the racism in this society they don't want to talk about. All they want to talk about is supposed buggery, which leads you down the road of blaming the victims. And I will finish, as Malcolm X put it, careful when you read the mass media, because the mass media can get you hating the people that are oppressed and loving the oppressor. And that's exactly what they've been trying to do here, and we can stop them.